They call us the greatest generation, but it didn't start out that way. I dropped out of school when I was 16 because I wasn't doing very good in school and decided to join the service because I had an uncle that served 30 years in the military and he was kind of a role model for me. But they told me I didn't have enough education. I needed a high school education for that. Something got mixed up and I ended up at Lowry Field, Denver, Colorado. I went overseas in November 1943 and started flying missions in B-17s. The missions were very scary, sometimes terrifying. I had to maintain discipline and also try to keep my feelings to myself so my crew wouldn't think that I was that scared, which I know they were going through the same thing. I had a navigator killed, bombardier wounded. We were shot out of formation 3 times.
England prepared for bombings that would become part of every child's life.
We were required to carry a gas mask when we went to London, but we didn't figure there was much threat of a gas attack. So we take the gas mask out, set that aside, fill it with all this goodies we had for the kids, citrus fruit or chocolates and chewing gum and anything that the children would like. And we would take it to London. The kids would meet us at the train stations and follow us and they'd say, "Any gumchum?" Yeah.
German bombers did attack several coastal targets, but the majority of the raids were further inland.
We were 60 miles southwest of London, and we could see a glow in the sky where London was on fire. It was the most terrible thing.
We would go out in the garden, our jaws agape, looking up and seeing what was going on. And my mother would scream at us, "Come in, come in." And there was shrapnel falling, and we used to gather it. It was hot. I went out once and picked up one piece to take to school to show the girls at school, and it was red hot, got my hand burned pretty badly. And it was something of a treat, I suppose, to be able to say, look what we got.
As the bombing campaign known as the Blitz got underway, Brighton and the neighboring city Patcham were bombed 56 times, but no one forgot Saturday, September 14th, 1940.
Every Saturday morning, the local cinema had children's matinees and Mickey Mouse shorts. And my mother would never let us go. She said, "You never know what you're going to pick up in the cinema with all those kids there." And there was a special film for children, one Saturday morning, I think it was 1941. And the sirens went, and always on the screen, it said, "The sirens are gone. You may leave the theatre if you want and go to the shelters." And apparently most of the kids didn't. They didn't want to get up. They were fed up. The sirens were always going. And they got a direct hit. That was a very black day in Brighton. The Curzon Cinema was flattened. And we caught the bus, I think 2 or 3 days later, to go and saw the rubble in the street. And there were women still standing there with their hands clasped and saying, crying for their children. But over 100 kids in one small town was a terrible lot to lose.
On January 26, 1942, the first of 4,000 of an eventual 1.5 million GIs arrived in Britain to prepare for the invasion of Europe.
And then the Americans started arriving, and I think England must have sunk at least 3 inches into the ocean because they were everywhere. And their uniforms were marvelous. Olive green jackets and mushroom pink pants.
We made fun of the Germans. Of course, one had to. You've got to boost the population, to feel that, yes, we are winning.
The Americans' arrival proved a culture shock to the British, who had never before seen young men so breezy, chatty, friendly, generous, and self-confident. The British girls were mightily impressed.
And of course, everybody was doing, wasn't rock and roll, not bebop, can't remember, jitterbugging, that was the word, jitterbugging. And if you went to the local dance hall, there were these Americans who had all the cigarettes in the world. And of course they quite put the noses out of joint of the Canadians and the English soldiers because of the money that they had. And they had silk stockings, nylons in their pockets, which they used for various purposes.
They evacuated London during the Blitz, sent the kids out to the country. Some were orphans, some were, they just wanted to make it safer for them. But the Americans kind of took to these kids because they had left their children and their brothers and sisters at home, and they kind of filled in for them. And then we became father figures for the children. So at various times we'd have parties for the kids, especially at Christmas time.
All this brought a real affection for the Americans as they began coming over to help fight the Nazis. After months of preparation, Americans finally began flying bombing missions.
And you saw wave after wave of B-17s going over with some other fighter planes, you know, sort of guarding them at the side. And I remember standing outside our back door in our, you know, little patio thing that we had in front of the back door with my mother, and we would pray. We would say, oh God, please, let them come back, let them come back.
In 1948, the Russians decided to blockade Berlin because it was in their territory and they wanted to force the Allies out. The way they blockade was they stop all ground traffic into Berlin, the railroads and the highways that would bring needed food to the people in Berlin because the people were starving. The town was devastated by bombings. An American general in Berlin decided that they would try to airlift food to them. It was almost an impossible job of what we had. I was at Lowry Field in Denver, and I was called, and 2 hours later I was headed for Berlin with a pregnant wife of 2 months. And I didn't exactly want to leave her, but in the Air Force it's not a democratic organization, so I went where they sent me. I got to Frankfurt, Germany, and then they shipped me to a place called Oberpfaffenhofen, which I bombed during the war. And it was interesting to go back. And as we traveled through Germany in trains, I noticed all the devastation that happened to them. When I arrived there, I found I was going to be an inspector on the line for 200-hour inspections on aircraft that were flying the Berlin area. They landed an airplane every 3 minutes, 24 hours a day, bringing in food, coal, flour, anything they could, and concrete to build runways that had been bombed. The Germans worked with us. It was a very interesting experience because it was a good closing for the war. It was a healing thing between the Germans and the Americans to work together and try to save the city of Berlin. One of the pilots decided that these children were watching They were standing under the flight path of the aircraft, and he decided that these children had never tasted candy. They had never had fresh fruit. So he started throwing the stuff out, collecting it and throwing it out as he was making his approach. Well, everybody got excited about this, so the women were making parachutes and they were taking boxes of raisins, they were candy bars. Everybody was donating their candy rations and their fruit and stuff, and they were throwing these out as they would approach these children. One little girl wrote to the commanding officer, and she said, "I live under the flight path of the airplanes, and I have these white chickens, and the chickens are starting not to lay eggs because of the noise. But if you see those white chickens, throw out the candy."
Whenever there's an air show, sure enough, there would always be an old pilot with an old renovated B-17. And you know, I couldn't control my tears.